This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Travish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is Dr. Jessica Lovering, Senior Fellow with the Nuclear Innovation Alliance and author of the recently released Right-Sizing Reactors, Balancing Trade-offs Between Economies of Scale and Volume. Jessica is going to describe research findings that can help nuclear technology innovators identify which of their many emerging sizes and types of reactors is right for each specific use case and marketplace. Jessica began her career in 2006 at the Southwest Research Institute as an assistant on the NASA missions to Pluto. Later, she was director of energy at the Breakthrough Institute, co-founder and executive director of the Good Energy Collective, and fellow with the Energy for Growth Hub. She joined the Nuclear Innovation Alliance in early 2025 and is also a postdoctoral researcher at Sweden's Uppsala University. So, Jessica, let's begin with the driver for your right sizing reactors paper, which is about the trade offs between economies of scale and volume. We're going to talk more in detail about scale and volume in a minute, but first, let's go back. Nuclear power is no longer only about these huge scale generation plants that were built in the 1970s and somewhat in the 80s. Can you tell us a little about how nuclear power plants have evolved to what they are now?
Well, for the most part, they still are really big in that we're mostly still operating the plants that were built in the 70s and 80s. Uh, but going forward, there's a lot of emphasis now on uh, building new kinds of reactors and developing new technologies. And there's more of a focus in smaller reactors and modular reactors, and particularly because of problems with the last generation or the last fleet of reactors that were very large, and a lot of them got very expensive and had a lot of problems with cost overruns and cost escalation because they were so large. These big mega projects, and so there's hope and promise that if new nuclear can be built in a different way, more like a mass produced product, like a Boeing aircraft or a car on an assembly line, that maybe the cost can come down over time with those economies of volume, and that it can become cheaper than it has been in the past.
I think your paper talks a little bit about sort of how we got from there to here. Can you just mention a couple of the highlights in that evolution? Where did people, when did people start suddenly thinking about let's build these little reactors?
Yeah, there's when we built out most of the nuclear that's operating today in the 60s and 70s, there was huge growth in demand for electricity. And so it just seemed natural that nuclear would scale up in size to match because there was such a hunger and an appetite for electricity that if you could build the plants bigger, it made sense because absolutely there was economies of scale, and we definitely see this in the literature, the economics literature, which I review in the report. There absolutely is economies of scale for nuclear power, um, and so it does get cheaper when you build it bigger.
Mm.
Um, but the plants also get a lot more complex. Nuclear is a very complex technology, and the engineering is very complex, and so you also see a lot of challenges with these very large plants with these complicated pumps and systems and safety systems and redundant safety systems, and so you see projects going recently over budget by two times, 200% over budget. And so starting in the mid 2000s, an interest in seeing if there could be a way to do nuclear differently. And the lessons really come from other energy technologies, looking at how not
Uh,
just things like wind and solar, which are built modularly on assembly line, but even things
right.
like natural gas turbines are built modularly. And so learning from other technologies, how they're built in a way that's faster and deployed in a way that's more plug and play, and
Right.
trying to learn from those other technologies.
That makes a lot of sense. Now I can see that how that would evolve from one to the other. Your research shows how the economies of scale that the 1970s plant designs pursued, those to some extent they had that there was a dream really of making nuclear generation too cheap to meter. It was a common phrase back then. It's often brought up even today. Um, but that is what you're saying can be replaced by economies of volume. So first of all, can you explain where too cheap to meter went wrong? What was wrong with that idea? And then what does your research show about how nuclear technology is now more about economies of volume?
Yeah, so the phrase too cheap to meter, so part of that is just the fuel, uranium, that it's so energy dense that there were predictions at the time that you could, when you scaled up the technology, the electricity would be so cheap just because of that extreme fuel density. And it was, quite cheap at the time. And it still is from existing plants that are operating today. That in the future, once we, built out these huge nuclear fleets, there were predictions that the electricity would be too cheap to meter. This was a belief at the time that in the future, electricity would be so cheap from nuclear power. Um, and it didn't come true for a lot of different reasons. Um, but moving forward to today, how that plays out, I think there is still a tension between economies of scale and economies of volume because the economies of scale are very real. I don't want to downplay that. Um, and when you move to smaller reactors, you are losing out on some of those economies of scale.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so economies of scale is if you have a really big plant, it's just one investment, and when you have the uranium, the fuel, uh, at a very low cost, you have a big production of electricity at a very low fuel cost. That's what you
Yeah,
mean by
and
economies of scale, right?
per unit of size, the energy is cheaper. Per kilowatt, um, dollars per kilowatt, the power plant is cheaper.
And what do you mean by economies of volume?
Yeah,
What
so economies of volume would be the economies you would get from mass production.
ah,
So the first of a kind plant from a small modular reactor is likely going to be quite expensive and much more expensive than your large reactor. But the promise or the expectation is that it will reduce in cost faster over time as you get these faster learning from um, modularization, from building in series. You don't necessarily have to have like true factory fabrication. Um, any amount of modularization, even if you're building, larger modular reactors, um, any amount of modularization really helps accelerate that learning. So building in series standardized reactors uh, helps reduce the cost over time. And you see this with larger reactors too. So there was a good paper on Chinese nuclear costs that came out last summer. And what they see is that China has been able to bring down costs over time with their large reactors. And they did this through a lot of different factors, but one key thing is standardized designs
right.
and
They build
domestic.
they build
And
a whole
yeah,
they build a lot of the plants, right?
yeah. And they do them in series and they do that with paced deployment. So they do a lot of learning between designs and then sharing that learning across their construction teams. And so that's what economies of volume is.
we've seen that over and over in the last few decades. I mean, cell phones, solar panels, all these things get electric vehicles. Everything gets cheaper as you start developing a standardized design and reproducing them at volume because
Yeah.
it's just the old Henry Ford production line, right?
So this is a very new paradigm for nuclear, and it's never been built this way commercially. It's definitely been built this way for the nuclear navy, but not commercially. And so it's very hypothetical having fossil lines like this, but there's a lot of interest in this being an option, particularly as in deregulated power markets where there's smaller utilities or a need for more incremental growth in additions of power, and where smaller units might be a better fit for the market.
Perfect segue. Perfect segue. It's almost like you were reading my mind, Jessica. The paper describes several different types of markets, and so there's not just one market. It used to be big nuclear power plant for the electricity system, but that's not how it is at all anymore. And as you said, a new technology, a new concept. So you have many versions of this technology that are emerging all over the country, different uh, manufacturers, different startups. So what you're doing in your paper is you're kind of picking out the types of markets that need different kinds of reactors, and you're suggesting which nuclear technologies would make the best economic sense for each of those different markets. So that's a rather abstract, and really there's too many announcements for me to keep track of how many technologies. Can you give us some examples of technologies that modular technologies that you're interested in and what kinds of markets they might be best for?
Yeah, and that was something that really motivated this report was people fighting a little bit about sort of which was going to win out or which was going to be cheaper, micro reactors or large reactors like AP1000s, and which was going to win out, economies of scale or these mass manufactured reactors. And what we found in the report is that there's good cases for both, but there's also just enough markets for all the different sizes. And there's very different markets for the different sizes. And um, they should we should really focus on kind of enabling the policy support and sort of the matchmaking for the customers and the different reactor sizes.
We're going to talk
So
about
some
that in a minute. We're going to talk about that
yeah,
in a minute,
so
but I just want
yeah,
I
so
think
let me
you're
give you some
looking for
examples.
examples. Yeah.
So one that I focused on in my PhD research was microreactors for off-grid and microgrid applications. And I think, a lot of times when people think about off-grid applications, they're thinking about renewables. But there's a lot of places that are off-grid that are very diesel dependent, and they're paying a lot of money for electricity. Um, but they need very reliable electricity, whether they're in a very cold place, and they need very reliable electricity, so they're willing to pay a lot for electricity. So nuclear, if they could find a very small nuclear reactor, like a micro reactor under 10 megawatts, say, that would be a very good fit for them. And another one that's getting a lot of interest from the government right now is defense installations. So like military bases um, uh, are another good application for
If
micro
you're in the middle of
reactors.
the if you're in the middle of the desert in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever we might go
Yeah,
next,
where it's very difficult to deliver fuel, and
right?
very makes you very vulnerable to be delivering fuel.
If you're
And
depending
so,
on gasoline or coal or oil or something like that, you're delivering it in these giant trucks, and they're vulnerable to IEDs and things like that, right?
yeah. Um, so that's just one example, and one for SMRs in a larger size, like a 100 to 300 megawatt range, would be like an industrial process heat, where an industrial customer um, wants their own energy. They might want a mix of electricity and heat, but they want it very close. So they want it co-located on site. That's a very good use for an SMR because it can be sited so close to the customer. And so that's a unique application for SMRs that's difficult to do with a much larger reactor. Um,
Does that include data centers? Have you heard of the Geysers
yeah,
family talking about
there's
this?
actually a good report uh, that just came out from INL, Idaho National Laboratory, specifically looking at right sizing reactors for data centers. So if you're interested in data centers specifically, I encourage folks to seek out that report. But they find something similar that depends on the size of your data center and the demand of the data center, that an SMR might make sense in some scenarios, and a larger reactor might make sense in some scenarios, depending on the demand and the reliability needs, things like that.
Good. All right. Heads up for our listeners. We just did a podcast recently with the head of Idaho National Laboratories, and he talks briefly, not as articulately or at length as Dr. Lovering here, but he does talk about those that work at INL. So, Jessica, one last question before we close this out. Um, you wrote in the paper that today's challenge right now is to create conditions that allow matching the right reactor with each customer's unique and specific needs. Now you've described some of that, but what are the conditions that you mean that we need to create? Is it policy? Is it technology advances? Is it a wider and better understanding of each reactor type? I don't understand what you mean by the conditions that allow doing this.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is policy, and
What kind of
I
policy?
think, yeah. So I think there's a lot of overlap in the policy needs for both these different sizes. Particularly, you know, all the different sizes need help with financing, uh, and they all need, I would say, more help with kind of those demand pull policies.
Oh,
What like tax credits or low carbon portfolio standards or things that create the incentives or the demand for clean energy that get those customers um, to want nuclear or utilities to want nuclear. Some things that are unique for small reactors might be more on the regulatory reform side, like high volume licensing or better guidelines on manufacturing licensing. Um, and some things that can help with very large reactors are more coordinated industrial policy at the federal level, just because those large reactors um, kind of take a lot more work on the supply chain side. There can be some more risk for those really large projects, and they take more on the best practices for project management.
ah,
And they tend to need a little more. They tend to, I would say, be more successful in regions that have or countries that have state-owned utilities or public utilities or are in regulated power markets. And so, if you have, say, low-cost financing or cheaper access to or cheaper financing, that can really help with those larger projects.
okay. It sounds like what you're saying is that there's plenty of interest in technology advances from entrepreneurs because they see the value in this in developing these new kinds of reactors, and probably the understanding of the reactor types is going to come from just the process of the market thinning the herd, so to speak. But policy can sort of support all of that activity. Tax anything from tax credits to rules about manufacturing domestically, things that we've already seen for other innovative energy types in the last couple of decades. It sounds like that's kind of what you're saying. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
one last question. do you think that NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is going to have to, in this country, is going to have to sort of open up new departments and open up new relationships with people who better understand these kinds of technologies?
Mm, I think they've already been doing a lot. They already have a lot in progress. Yeah, since the uh legislation that's been ongoing in the past several years. So they've already got a lot in progress. I think they're doing great work. So we should just help them implement what's ongoing.
Okay, good. All right, that's a good place to leave it. This has been a really interesting conversation about the new emerging nuclear technologies. I want to thank my guest, Nuclear Innovation Alliance Senior Fellow Dr. Jessica Lovering. She's described the key findings in her recently released paper, Right Sizing Reactors, Balancing Trade-offs Between Economies of Scale and Volume. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.